for most of us, we can't just say, I hate my job and then quit.
Right.
Because we don't know where we're going, right? This is the whole point. So if you have a direction, you can say, okay, I can't stand my job. And you can start thinking about,
Accept it. Accept I can't stand my job.
Yes.
That doesn't mean I even need to do anything.
Right.
I can just accept that.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think you have to.
Mm-hmm.
And then to start thinking about, okay, if this is what I don't want, what would be the characteristics of what I do want?
Hey, you found yourself in The Groove, a podcast where we create space for reflection and conversation to unfold. We explore the human experiences that connect us all to deepen our understanding of ourselves, our connection to the world, and the ways we engage with the aliveness within us. We're glad you're here.
Hey, Carly.
Hey, Mom.
Here we are. We're back for another episode.
Here we are.
Yeah, I bet you've been wondering what I'm thinking about and bringing to the table.
Perpetually. Always.
I'm sure. Because what else is a daughter thinking about? So here's what I've been thinking about and that I want to kind of talk about.
Cool.
A lot of times, my own life included, and when I talk with people in my coaching practice, they're really trying to find direction in a lot of different ways. It could be with work, it could be with finances, it could be with their eating habits, their whatever.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to me that one of the things that I've become really aware of is many people know what they don't want, but they don't necessarily know what they do want. And that might sound like a little bit of a nuance of a thing for those of you who are listening, but it's not.
Mm-mm.
If I say to you, and I think I brought this up in another podcast episode, if I say to you, don't think of a red barn.
I'm thinking of a red barn.
Right, because there's so many other things. There's so much else you could be thinking about that. How do you choose? So even if you think of the red barn with a big red slash through it, you're still thinking of the red barn.
It makes me think too of the difference of moving away from something versus moving towards something. And what a different feeling that alone creates.
Yeah. Yeah. Another way I think of this too is in education. As we work with students in education, you want your feedback to them to be about what you want them to do, not what you don't want them to do. Sports coaching is the same thing. Like when I coached volleyball, I didn't say, don't miss.
You should have.
Maybe
that,
maybe that would have
that's
been
the
more
secret to
effective.
coaching.
Yeah. I might have said, make sure you follow through
Yeah.
because that's what you want.
It's
And
an
it
action
makes it
step.
very different. It's an action step and something that you can focus on that's really productive.
It also makes me think when we say don't do this, we're automatically judging ourselves on if we've done the thing or not. And that immediately puts us into this space of measuring ourselves, judging ourselves, deciding if we're right or wrong in each moment.
Yeah.
Which is a really difficult place to be. And what I'm already kind of gathering is that finding direction, finding what we want is probably in our growth zone. And when we're in our growth zone, if we're also in judgment or we find ourselves moving towards judgment, we're moving out of our growth zone.
Yeah. That's a really good point. It aligns so much with that because picking or choosing a direction to move toward does move you out of your comfort zone and into your growth zone because it's a shift in what you're doing.
Absolutely.
Because you're thinking about what you want.
Yeah, maybe if it's even something you already know, but
Yeah.
you're revisiting it or re-engaging with it, it's still putting you in this place of growth because who you are now might be different than who you were the last time you were engaging with something.
Yeah.
And it's a constant experience of engagement in a new way.
Yeah. So it makes me think of when you don't know exactly where you're going and what you want, how do you start to figure it out? Because it can be overwhelming sometimes to figure out what you do want. It's really simple to figure out what you don't want. Like you go to a restaurant and you say, I don't want chicken.
Boom. Great. Chicken, gone. Eliminate that option.
Yeah. And when you go to a restaurant that has a menu that has many, many pages, it actually becomes overwhelming to start to figure out what it is that you do want.
So this immediately, before we even go any further, what it's making me think about is how, as humans, we like a certain amount of choice.
Yeah.
We like to know that we have autonomy without being overwhelmed. And this is something that I'm already thinking about as we continue this conversation, is maybe even right-sizing the amount of choice we're giving ourselves so that we're creating opportunity instead of limiting the directions we can go in.
Yeah. Yeah, because it can be so overwhelming. That's a really good point. Do you have things that you're kind of unfolding in terms of what you want?
So actually, this whole last summer, like late spring to fall, was kind of this recentering and realigning phase in my life. And it felt really, really significant, more so than it has in the past. And I think the significance came from the intention with which I treated it as this opportunity to really rebuild or strengthen, I think is the better word, a sense of chemistry I have with myself to kind of help unfold who I am, the paths I want to play with, the spaces I want to get into, what I want to pursue in my own aliveness.
Mm.
And it was a situation where I was actively putting myself in my growth zone to see what happened and the directions that could be there. I think there was a recognition for me of, I have some idea of the direction, but I don't know all of them, and I want this exploratory period to see what happens.
Did it help you find a direction or a path moving forward?
It got me here.
In the end, and where are we? Where are you?
What's going on?
Where am I? Who am I?
But actually, like, doing and engaging with this project of the podcast, of the videos, of creating in a way that I think explores my own aliveness, I think happened because of the space I gave myself this summer. Like, it was like this expedited, like, Camp Carly is kind of what I called it.
I love that.
But it was really this deep allowance of consistently engaging with things that felt really good and aligned for me, and letting myself feel this like joy and exuberance in what I was doing and what I was playing with, and just exposing myself to new opportunities and creating spaces for those adventures, I guess, to unfold. And it helped me find direction, not only in where I wanted to go, but who I really enjoy being.
Mm. Who you enjoy being.
Yeah.
That right there is direction.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I really came back to some internal values. And what I realized at the end of last spring, I went through a breakup. And I was like, oh, am I living in alignment with the values that feel really good for me? And this summer was a kind of like a realignment of living in my values and giving myself the space and permission to take everything that I was doing and look at it through this lens of my values. And my values are really like playfulness, curiosity, and rhythm. In this idea of how can I live in attunement to myself and in rhythm with myself rather than rigidity.
Do you think you accessed those values in the process of getting to know yourself better, or did you find a direction and then think about your values?
This is a real horse and cart question, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I think I already had an idea of what those values were
Yeah.
for me. And it was through like a self-led, like Brene Brown value, taking stock.
Yeah.
What's
inventory?
that word? Inventory. Thank you. Second episode in a row where you got me with the word I didn't know.
I know you.
Yeah. No, it was through this like values inventory, and those were the words that just really deeply resonated with me. And so then it became this like, okay, I have this kind of framework. Let me take inventory of the decisions that I'm making and slow down and be like, how are these aligning with my values? How much is this decision aligned with my values? Because sometimes it'd be slightly in alignment, sometimes way out. And often I figured out that I could shift the way I was engaging with something to more deeply align with the values without getting really far off track
Yeah, without
or like
changing the whole
losing the
thing.
plot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're saying something that I think is really interesting, and that's the idea of knowing your values and then checking, are the things that I'm doing in alignment with the values that are really important to me?
Yeah.
Sometimes we just keep going along in life and we don't even think about, does this align with what I really find important in life? Because we get caught up in life, and there's so much to the pace and the rhythm of contemporary lives that it's easy to do. You could say your family is really important and that's a really important value to you, and then you find yourself working lots of extra hours at work and making these decisions that don't really align, even though you do really believe family is important.
Yeah.
And so I think part of finding your direction is knowing, is what I'm doing aligned with the things that I see as really, really important.
Yeah.
For those of you listening, our cat's popping
Our
in the room.
cat's having a good time. Just creating a little chaos. I think a lot about like the bricks build the house. And when I say this, it's very much in the way of like, I think it's easy for us to say like, okay, well, I'll practice embodying this value on a bigger decision or a decision that's really meaningful. And I think so often we can put off aligning the decisions that we're making with the values because how we're living, how we're making that decision, maybe a little bit outside of our values, is something that we've practiced or we know or we understand more deeply than if we were aligning it with our values. Because I think so often we don't drop into like kind of this intuitive sense of aligning to our values, or even this like heart-led sense, because I think there's so much like woo-woo noise around like heart-centered decision making where it's like
What does
almost
that mean?
right.
Yeah,
Like
what does that
what
exactly
does
mean?
that mean?
Yeah.
And I think this is also a false binary where if you're making a decision with your heart, then you must not be making a decision with your head. And I think, yeah.
Yeah, that could really cause a lot of uncertainty and almost like this clash within yourself.
Yeah. And I think we also tend to really prioritize logic-based, rational decisions. And we're thinking that if it's logic and rational based, then it can't be heart-centered. When I think in reality, there's way more of a Venn diagram between those decisions than we realize.
I love that you just said Venn diagram, because that's exactly what I was thinking about. You have this things that go on in your head that you're thinking about that are very logical. And on the other side of the Venn diagram is really like our gut feelings about something and our intuition about something. And it's not an either or. It's where do those two things cross over and where are the commonalities that you see? I think that can really help us to create direction in our lives. I think in that part of the Venn diagram too, where with the intuition is, what are our values? Those tend to be really heart-centered components and not this, okay, I want to achieve this and I want to do this and I want to achieve this. It's this intuition of who am I? What do I want to be? What are my values? And how do they intersect with some of the maybe achievements that you want to make? I don't know. It could be anything.
Yeah. One of the things too that I think of as I hear the word intuition or a gut feeling that I think is helpful to point out is our brains are really good at this thing called thin slicing, which is taking a whole bunch of information that we know very quickly and creating an answer based on things we've experienced, things we've interacted with, things that we have some level of information of that may be a little subconscious that our brain is actively fitting together to be like, here's a gut feeling.
So I want to get back to this finding direction when you don't know where you want to go and figuring out what you do want, because I think that's a really important piece. It's like when you go to the grocery store to buy groceries, you don't list all the things you don't want.
That would be a very long list.
It would be a really long list. Instead, you really focus in on the things that you do want, and then you know exactly where to go in the grocery store, and it's a much quicker trip, right?
To go along with this analogy too, before you even go grocery shopping, you probably are thinking about, or maybe it's an invitation to think about what would be really yummy and tasty for me to eat this week.
Yeah.
That's the place you start to build the list of what you need.
Yeah. And also what aligns with your values around
Mm.
your nutritional intake.
Mm.
What's important to you about food.
Yeah.
And then you build, which kind of makes me think about values. And we've talked a little bit about that already. But, one of the things I found to be a really interesting exercise is to start journaling and just writing down in your ideal world, what does a typical day look like? And there's always going to be some variation, and this doesn't need to be perfect. And I think that's really important. But just to start getting some ideas down, like if my life were perfect, what time would I be waking up? What would I be doing, for the first hour, for the second hour? How much of my day would I be working? Would I be working in an office? Would I be working out of home? Like to really lay it out. And you can do this within a relationship and think about, what do I want in a relationship? What do I want it to look like? What am I doing? What's the other person doing? What do we do together? What does it look like? Because then you start to imagine what's possible for direction.
I would also add, what do you want it to feel like?
Yeah. What do you want it to feel like?
What are the feelings that you're actively engaging with that are consistent, that are a framework of your aliveness? And I call that like dream lifing. And I think the other really fun thing that we sometimes forget to do, and I think this is such a great way to exercise our free will, is that when you're dream lifing, you could create as many dream lives as you want. And I think that that's actually a really helpful tool. Often in like art, for example, or really design, which again, you're kind of thinking about some solutions or some frameworks to play with. You don't do one design and be like, yep, that's it.
Oh, yeah.
That I nailed it. Usually it's like design like 9, where you've gotten through the first 4. And I think often with dream lifing, for me, what I've experienced is like when I've done this before, the first 3 dream lives are like kind of these, they're very aligned with social norms or societal norms. And not always, but there's like these elements of it that are not even actively added in, that are like, oh, well, I think that's part of this life.
Yeah.
But then by the time you get to 4th life, you're like, well, actually, what if my dream life is to like live underwater and like, but here's the thing. That sounds crazy. Like I get that sounds so out
Maybe
of it.
a little.
But to me, it's like, okay, but what is that holding for me in the feeling of like, if there's this underwater life that I'm creating? And maybe it's this like that I am coming up with the rhythms of my own life that aren't aligned with what I know.
It just made me think of silence.
Yeah.
Like maybe it's the quiet to be able to make the decisions for yourself without all the input from what the societal expectations are.
Yeah, or like a place that you can retreat to and feel safe in.
Yeah.
Like maybe that's what I really am looking for in my life.
Yeah.
And what my brain is creating is this like underwater world. But,
Yeah.
Or like allowing yourself to experience and play with like different roles that you would engage with in your life. And they could be silly, they could be ridiculous, but I think giving ourselves the opportunity to play with kind of these like fictional lives usually tells us something that we need to know about ourselves that we haven't fully looked at yet because we deem it to be too big or too crazy or too much.
Okay, my next job, I'm gonna write 5 versions of my future life.
I love it.
I love this idea of multiple versions of it.
Yeah.
Because then the first one that you write doesn't have to be the one.
It takes the pressure off.
It totally takes the pressure off. One of the things that you've shared with me, and I think if I remember correctly, you read this somewhere or learned it somewhere, but when like in a photography class, and there's a group of photographers that are instructed to take as many pictures as you possibly can over the course of the course. And then another group that are told, I want you to create the perfect picture. You need to have like the award-winning picture.
Yes.
Or photograph. And inevitably what happens over and over and over again is the students who've been instructed to take lots and lots of photos get the best photos.
I think sometimes we really conflate like this idea of quality over quantity as the only way to move through a situation.
Yeah.
And I think so often when it comes to creative endeavors, and in this case, playing with what our dream lives are is a creative endeavor. If we limit ourselves to having it be only quality, and only if it's quality is it worth pursuing our time with, we so limit ourselves in what could be
Yeah.
otherwise. And our brains love playing with things. Like our brains want to engage with ideas. Like if you think about like even anxiety spirals, how good our brains are at coming up with the next anxious thought. Like they want to keep giving you thoughts. Like the quantity will happen so long as you open the door for it to occur.
Yeah.
But if we're constantly judging the quality of the thought before the next thing can happen, we're just
Yeah.
shutting doors.
Or the quality of the idea. So if I start creating this idea of what I want my life to look like, and I'm busy judging it or deciding, evaluating whether that's havable or not havable.
Or thinking about how other people would respond to you living your life this way before you even lived your life this way.
Yeah. Yeah. Then it's a complete shutdown and you're no
Uh-huh.
longer creating and playing with some different ideas. So I think the other thing that really resonates with what you said is if you write multiple ideas of what you might want your life to look like, or your relationship, or your job, like you could, for listeners, I don't want you to think it's has to be just your whole life. You could
Right.
really narrow in on a particular part of your life. But if you start writing a couple different stories about it that resonate with you, first of all, they don't have to be right. You could
Mm-hmm.
write a wrong idea.
Yes.
And it's okay because you're just playing with ideas. Nobody's holding you to the ideas that you write.
Right.
But also to notice through lines in each of the ideas you have about what it might look like. What are the constants that you now see so that you can read through and say, oh, you know what's always in this idea is me being able to be flexible with my schedule. Like maybe that's something that comes up over and over again.
Yeah.
Or having a space of time in the morning where I really get to ground myself in the day. That may come up over and over again. And I think that starts to help you know what are some of the high priorities that you might have in how you're living your life or how you want to live your life.
Yeah. Oh, I'm really, so one of the things that you said that has kind of just opened something in me too that made me put some pieces together is this idea of a story and how so often I think we don't give ourselves the opportunity to engage with media and story as inspiration for the ways that we want to live our life. And this is where I think art and shows and books and fiction can be so helpful in the situation. I started reading a lot more like stories this year, and I loved it. And it started making me branch out into other stories and read more and more. And what I really noticed myself doing is as I read these stories of these characters that in some ways we're all going to see ourselves in, I was like, I want to live my life like that. Oh, I want to feel like this. And so now also, instead of me trying to come up with the building blocks, I had this array of building blocks from stories that I read that resonated with me, even if they were fictional. Actually, I think especially if they were fictional.
It's like exposure to multiple ways.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think sometimes we can get so into the life that we know
And are
that
familiar with.
are familiar with that we forget that we can kind of like push these bounds a little bit.
Yeah.
And that fiction is actually a really, really, really helpful tool for us to play with some of this reality. It's like the allowance of suspension of belief that we can then bring into our lives when we're trying to think about what we could feel like or what we want this to feel like, and having a template from somewhere else.
Yeah.
That we just like kind of tweak and right size.
One of the words that just came up in my head is playing with ideas. It's just play. And I think if people are thinking about what they want in their lives and they start writing things down and it feels way too dreamy or I can't have that, you're playing with words and ideas right now. Just play with it
Yeah.
and see what comes up. Because you don't have to be right. with what you write. You just have to start getting some ideas going and flowing so that you can start recognizing what are some really important values to you, or what are some really important components to you that you want to make sure that you have in whatever it is you're trying to direct.
And I think that's such an exercise too in helping our brains learn that we can push kind of into this growth zone, because I think when we shut things down, it's because we're getting into a judgment zone, because we're in a
Yeah.
growth zone. And our brains are trying to protect us from the unknown
Yeah.
because it knows the life that we live right now.
Yeah. And probably our parents' lives, and it may all be very similar because
Yeah,
that's the example we have.
right.
And it goes back to, you may know that's not the life I want to live, but you don't know what is.
Yeah.
And so it goes back to that. How do you start figuring out what you want instead of what you don't want? Because if you have to start thinking about, okay, if I don't want that, where is it I'm directing myself? Because you don't want to just direct yourself away from that, because then you could end up anywhere. And it's not that that can't ever work, because sometimes it does,
Yep.
but I think, gives you a much greater sense of autonomy over your life when you can start thinking about, what do I want this to look like? And how can I start taking steps in that direction?
One of the things that came to mind, and I'd love to ask this of you, is around your style of parenting.
Mm,
And I think this maybe is like something that people very often face
yeah.
is they know the lived experience they had growing up.
Mm,
And if they're deciding to become parents themselves, they don't want that for their kids for whatever reason.
yeah.
And I think often we can go to the opposite side,
Yeah.
which again is a false binary. And it's like, what's the secret third option?
Yeah.
And that's kind of the question of life. I find myself asking, I was like, okay, false binary, what's the secret third option? But,
Or fourth or fifth.
or fourth, when I say secret third option, I really mean like, what's the field of pure potential that we're not looking at?
Yeah. Because in the binary, you're not. If you think of a binary on a continuum, you have this or that. And then in the middle, there's so much
Right. And
to play around with.
The secret third option is just all of that. Like
Yeah.
the secret third option to me is the container for everything else we're not looking
That's
at
not
yet.
the binaries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But would you be willing to talk a little bit about how you decided the direction that you wanted to take with parenting? Because
Yeah.
I think you took a very intentional direction.
Yeah. I did. And we did as parents. So to back up a little bit about what you were saying, when I grew up, it was definitely more, very rule focused, discipline focused, a lot more rigid.
Discipline in the controlling,
Yes.
punishing way.
Yeah.
More than,
Yes.
yeah.
And so I remember not wanting that, and that's so many of us say, when I grow up and I become a parent, I'm not going to do that. But what we don't answer is, okay, if it's not that, then what?
Right.
What is it that we're going to do? And you talked about going all the way over to the other side. So sometimes if you have parents that are really strict, you say, I don't want that. And so you go over to the other side of being really permissive.
Yeah.
And either one of those in that binary, I think as parents, for the most part, are going to create problems, just different types. And so I was really thoughtful about, what do I want parenting to look like? And how do I want this to play out? And before you were even born, I came across this book called How to Talk So Kids Will Listen, and Listen So Kids Will Talk.
So you were actively seeking out other models to engage with.
Yeah. Yeah, I was like, and that's just a curious title.
Yeah.
Because so many parents will say, they just don't listen to me.
Yeah.
And also as an educator, because I was an educator at a very young age, like right out of college, I was 22, 23 years old, when I started recognizing how I interacted and what I said and the impact that it had on the students with whom I was working, and what was effective and what was ineffective. And so I really started digging into that a lot more. So I think one of the things that I really thought about as a parent is I wanted the experience of raising kids to be more of a guide than a disciplinarian, I guess is the right word. And I think when we talked about this in our last episode, when you are a disciple, right, it means you're learning from someone, and that's the relationship I wanted to have. So how can I create a parenting environment and a family environment where, yes, I'm the adult, and so my words are going to matter a lot. And how do I guide my children to learn what they need to learn and what our family values are, and at the same time develop a sense of trust in themselves? And I'll give you an example of how this plays out. When you were really little, and we would be, I don't know, in a living room of someone else's house, and it wasn't childproofed. And so, you're 3, 4 years old or whatever. Instead of saying, don't touch that, again, that's what you don't want, I would start telling you what I do want. You can use your eyes on that. That's for eyes only. And so now it gives you this whole different picture, and it worked so effectively where you're not thinking, I can't touch that. Oh my gosh, I can't touch this. And your finger gets closer and closer to it. And it's like, you don't want me to touch that? Because that's what has been conjured up in the head, right? Versus that's for your eyes only. It's like, oh, now I'm learning what I can do with it instead of what I can't do with it. So you could look at it, you could walk around it, you could admire it, like whatever are the things that you can do. And so that's an example of when you were a toddler, and I think as you grew up, we just kept providing information instead of these hard and fast rules that were because I said so. And I don't know, maybe I've said because I said so sometimes, but more about information,
One of the things that really is striking me, as you were talking about specifically too, when you were a young teacher and you were noticing what worked and what didn't, what I wrote down was this idea of both experiencing and observing life. And I think so often we're the experiencer that we forget to be like what I call the benevolent observer, where it's kind of zooming out. It's looking at yourself as the experiencer and just observing what's going on, or the responses and reactions that are occurring that you're then experiencing.
Yeah.
And so it's this idea of like creating a little bit of space. And I think about, as we think about the ways that we want to shift our lives, we're going back and forth in this period of being the experiencer and the observer. And I think I'm getting a foot cramp. This idea of
that's a distraction.
Oh my God, I don't know where it came from. As we think about this idea of being the experiencer, it's like allowing ourselves to fully be in life with the trust that we'll kind of take a step back and then observe what's going on. And this can happen simultaneously and in kind of like more structured environments, whether that's through like journaling or thinking and reflecting, that we're observing our experiences from a place of curiosity. And again, that to me is that whole like, are my experiences that I'm helping create for myself in alignment with the life that I want to live or the things that I want to feel? And how can I keep shifting these containers to feel more aligned?
Yeah. And they don't all have to shift at once.
Yeah.
It's like the old adage, Rome's not built in a day.
Yeah.
So you can have your dream life, and let's say you've written what you believe is your dream life, which by the way may be your dream life today, but a year from now it's like, or 10 years from now or whenever, it shifts a bit.
I think about the devotion of the way we live our lives and the unfolding process to it, that even if the dream life might shift, that there's a devotion to engaging with our aliveness in a way that feels really aligned in the moment right now. And I think that's where it comes back to this idea of values-based living as like this thesis that we can kind of keep coming back to as a structure.
Yeah. It's a core approach to the things that are really important and the steps that you take in your life.
Yeah.
It's something to look back at. Is this in alignment with this particular value I want to feel? I was thinking too of that prompting of writing 4 or 5 outlines, let's say, of what you want your life to look like. And you brought this up earlier, but also recognizing if you had that life, how would you feel?
Mm.
What are the feelings associated with it? Because usually we don't like some part of our life or our whole life or whatever it is, because there's a feeling that's associated with it that we don't like.
Mm.
It might be discontent, it might be frustration, it might be disappointment, it might be who knows what. But that's what we are. Again, we know we don't want that. We don't want to feel frustrated. We don't want to feel whatever the thing is. But if we start writing about what we want our dream life to look like first, and then how would I feel? So I think the first time I did this, the word that came up was free.
Mm.
I would feel free.
Yeah.
And when you see that value or that feeling come through multiple times, it starts to allow you to think about what are the things that I can do today, because my dream life isn't going to be created by tomorrow. But what can I start doing right now that's going to allow me to feel more free? Or if the word is to feel more
Grounded.
secure or whatever the word is, what can I start doing today that's in alignment with me feeling that way? So you're starting to access the feeling that you want before the dream life is actually there in your world.
And okay, so there's 2 things I'm thinking of. The first is giving ourselves permission to look at and accept that we are not feeling that sometimes.
Mm.
Like if we don't feel grounded. I think it can be really helpful to just look at it for what it is and accept that maybe I'm not feeling this thing right now.
Yeah.
Because I think so often, if we're not feeling what we want to feel, it's hard for us to accept that. Because maybe it's rooted in shame, like, oh, well, if I'm not feeling grounded, then I must be doing all the wrong things.
Mhm.
And this is a reflection on my abilities. And it's like, well, hold on, pause. That's a whole bunch of like, if you give a mouse a cookie, where it's like, can I just pause and be like, I can accept that I feel ungrounded right now. Like I can just accept that. And even in this moment, I don't have to do anything about it, but let me just acknowledge that this is something that I'm experiencing.
Yeah, it's being the observer, going without judgment, without trying to change something too quickly. Like just sit with it for a minute
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
two.
Yeah. And then as you identify, or as I identify what I do want to feel, I think sometimes, especially if it's novel or we're not used to it, we don't even know what that feels like yet to know what that is.
Yeah.
And this is where I think it can be really helpful to start creating experiences that are a little bit new, a little bit in our growth zone, where we can literally start building neural pathways to start activating that feeling.
Yeah. And it's all experimenting. So if you say you want to feel more grounded and you start thinking of things that, okay, what can I start doing that will help me feel more grounded? What on a daily basis can I start doing? And you might come up with something. Like, what would be something you'd come up with to feel more grounded, as an example?
Well, okay, so here's what I actually started thinking about is this idea of almost stacking things. So what's something that is so deep in my comfort zone right now that I can just attach a groundedness to?
Mm.
For example, every time I brush my teeth, how can I practice being really grounded as I do it?
Mm.
For 2 minutes
Yeah.
or however long you brush your teeth.
And what does grounded mean to you?
Present. My body feels relaxed. I am very much with this thing. Like, I think a lot about actually recently is whatever I'm doing is the most important thing that I'm doing. This is it. This is the most important thing I could be doing right now. And that's goes for washing dishes, doing chores.
The mundane.
Yeah, but then even like creating. Sometimes I get into the creative zone and I think about all of these other things that I should be doing. And I'm like, wait, no. Let me treat this as the most important thing that
Be
I'm doing
grounded
right
in
now.
this.
Be grounded in this.
Yeah. I think the other thing that I was thinking about as you decide, like, let's say it's, being present and relaxed and the things that will help you feel grounded. And then you go to try it and you may realize, oh, yeah, no, that's not what I need. That's actually not what I'm looking for. And you only know because you tried it.
Yeah.
And that's where I keep saying, you don't have to be right. You don't have to be right. Like, take a guess at what you really might want and then start trying it on for size. It's like when you go to try on clothes and you look at something on the rack, you're like, oh, I think I like that. And you put it on and you're like, hell no.
Right. Or I like it in theory, but this just doesn't make me feel like me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think this is the same way. There's some amount of trial and error with it. And I also want to say for people listening, like, this doesn't mean upend your whole life. If you want a different job or you want a different career path than what you've been on, for example, it doesn't mean you quit your job to start doing that new thing tomorrow. It means, okay, are there places in your current work where you can align with your value or the feeling that you want to experience as you continue exploring what direction I want to go in? And as you start creating that picture of what you want your life to look like or what you want your career to look like. Again, I think so much because for most of us, we can't just say, I hate my job and then quit.
Right.
Because we don't know where we're going, right? This is the whole point. So if you have a direction, you can say, okay, I can't stand my job. And you can start thinking about what
Accept it. Accept I can't stand my job.
Yes.
That doesn't mean I even need to do anything.
Right.
I can just accept that.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think you have to. And then to start thinking about, okay, if this is what I don't want, what would be the characteristics of what I do want? And sometimes I think, like with a job, you start thinking of all the jobs. But I want to go back to the idea of writing about what your perfect day would look like. Because it's like coming in the back door of what you might want, even for a career change. Because now you're thinking about, like I said before, what does my morning look like? Do I want to experience a lot of personal interaction with people or interpersonal actions, or would I rather really work by myself? Is it something I'd like to have a lot of flexibility so that I could start my day sometimes at 8, sometimes at 10, my work day is what I mean, and end, later or earlier, or that I have a break in the middle of the day? Like, what would really feel so aligned with me? And again, you start creating it. It doesn't mean you have to be right. You're just playing with ideas to see what feels right. Because sometimes if it's just swirling around in our heads, you don't get enough structure for what it could potentially look like, as if you talk it out loud with somebody or write it down for yourself.
Let me move us into a question off of this.
Yeah.
What are your signals when you need some direction or you need to find some new direction?
I think for me, when I look back on my life, and even now, I think there could be a varying degree of things. One is just this very deep feeling that this is not where I'm supposed to be. This is not the work I'm supposed to be doing. Like, I think of in jobs that I've had, that I'm not in the right place right now. Like, and it's just so obvious and so present and feels so misaligned that I lose sleep, which I hardly ever do. I'm a really good sleeper. Or I just feel this sense of overall discomfort. Like, I was going to say irritableness, but I think it's like just this overall discomfort with knowing that I'm not planted in the place where I can grow, right?
And I think, so I've felt this too. And one of the first times I felt it, the next feeling was this feeling of shame and guilt for even thinking that, or for even starting to recognize, I don't think I'm in the right place.
Yeah.
And I think it's important just to recognize that's a pretty understandable feeling, especially if things aren't good enough.
Yeah.
Like, especially if you're in a job or in a situation in your life that's good enough that you want to change. And like, how do you know what I mean?
Yes. And I think so often that's also based on what we perceive is acceptable to society or the community around us. And so you get stuck in, but this is good enough. And everybody tells me it's good enough. Like they tell me, wow, you've got a great job, or you've got fill in the blank with whatever it is. And so then you start to feel like you're ungrateful or something.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think when we feel a little bit lost and when we feel a little bit like we're looking for direction, it is very easy for us to feel guilty about wanting something better or different.
Mm,
And just because we want to shift something doesn't mean we're not appreciating what we do have. It's this idea of like multiple truths can exist at the same time.
yeah.
And getting out of the binary of good, bad, right, wrong, shame, not shame.
Yeah. Yeah. And looking at it to just describe it.
Yeah.
So if you describe it without judgment,
Yeah.
looking at whatever it is, whether it's a relationship or it's your job or what your family, how things are going within your family or whatever, to not look at it with judgment, but to describe it as if you are somebody that came from another planet that has no idea what this job looks like or family life might look like, to just describe what you see as factually as you can, and then to be able to decipher there, like, what are some of these pieces that I want to start shifting, because now it's not rooted in shame, or I've got to get away from that. It's okay, I don't like the way this is fitting me, and I want to get it fitted.
And I think so often this shame that we feel limits the amount of excitement that we can engage with as we build something new.
Yeah.
And how do we let ourselves put down the shame around any of this or guilt and pick up this feeling of excitement in shifting something? And like, to me, that also becomes being okay with the unknown and creating space with the recognition that the space is not emptiness, but something that we can allow to become and unfold in a way that feels really aligned
Mm,
without us trying to force it and fill it.
yeah. It's this curiosity of what could I create and what could it be like, and not limiting yourself by judging the answer to your potential curious questions, but to playing with them.
Yeah.
I think we chop off our ideas and our brainstorming so quickly with the, yeah, but that won't work because, or, oh, yeah, that would work, instead of brainstorming for a little while and playing around, even if it's ridiculous. Like when I
Yeah.
do things with the people I lead and I ask them to brainstorm something, I say the only thing you can say is yes and.
Yeah.
And you're just adding to, or what if we also, so it's things like that. So you're not throwing something out, because once you've thrown something out, and I'm using air quotes for that, you're no longer adding to it, playing around with it, being curious about what else it might be able to look like.
So this is making me think of like a design thinking process,
Mm,
and specifically divergent and convergent thinking, and that these are two frameworks of thinking that we can engage with. And divergent thinking is this idea of brainstorming,
yeah.
and convergent thinking is this idea of like figuring out what would work. And these are two separate processes that happen like literally on separate days if you're doing a design thinking
Yeah.
process usually. And it's really integral to give yourself the time and space to only brainstorm.
Yeah.
And that you have to get all of this clay out, all of your building blocks, all of the potential ways that you can engage with this thing before you start building it. And so in this analogy, it's like letting yourself brainstorm everything, letting yourself think about big ideas, pie in the sky concepts before you start whittling down and right sizing, because that's a
Yeah.
whole different phase.
It's a whole different phase. And don't even judge it.
Mhm.
Even if you have these ridiculous, what you perceive in that moment as ridiculous ideas, if it's something that inspires you in some way or compels you to write down in some way, write it.
Yeah.
Again, you don't have to be right. You putting it down or talking it out loud is not a commitment or devotion to it. It's just an idea that you're playing around with. And I
Yeah.
think that's so much of, when you're trying to find direction, it's playing with ideas. What's possible for direction?
Yeah.
And also incorporating, you talked about values earlier, incorporating your core values, and you can do some exercises to really figure out what your core values are. But to think about your core values and also to think about how you want to feel in your experience as a general rule,
Yeah.
not you're going to feel, for example, you talked about grounded before, you're not going to feel grounded every second of every day, but you want to feel that more often than what you're currently feeling. And so,
Yeah.
what can you play around with to start creating that?
So actually, as we're talking, I think using a design thinking framework might
Mm.
be really helpful to kind of like
Yeah. So what
bucket
do you
all
mean
of
by that?
this.
Yeah.
Okay.
Talk it
So
out.
there's a whole bunch of like design thinking frameworks, but
Yeah.
basically the idea of design thinking is you're devoting yourself to the process of the thing unfolding without holding in rigidity what the thing should be. So again, it's we're back to this devotion to the process
Yeah.
rather than holding on to an outcome. And
Yeah.
I think of it in like kind of these 4 gooey phases where they're not super like 1, 2, 3,
Yeah.
4,
It's
but it
not
has
concrete sequential. Yeah.
no, like there's some linearity, but there's also a lot of fluidity between them. And so the phases are understand, identify, build, refine. And these phases all talk to each other. Like it's more cyclical than linear, I guess. We start in 1, which is understand.
Yeah.
What we've kind of thought about is understanding what we want to feel, what we want to engage with, what feels really good to us,
What values we want to embody.
what values we want to embody, what we enjoy doing, maybe what we don't enjoy doing, but starting to really understand this current that we're playing with. Then we move to phase 2, which is identify. And to me, this means what are the vehicles that I can engage with in my life that bring me some of these feelings? Whether that's the career I'm in or not, whether
Yeah.
that's the relationships I'm in or want to build, whether
Yeah.
that's through engaging with a new hobby or sport or way of being.
Aligning with the values that are important to you. Yeah.
Exactly. And like how do I create opportunities for that?
Yeah.
And that's a lot of prototyping. It's a lot of like, okay, that could be
Yeah.
taking a class.
Yeah.
That could be interning at a different job. That could be like fill in the blank.
Yeah.
It's just starting to brainstorm what it could be while you, like identifying what could be with your understanding of what you're looking for.
Yeah.
And it's very open.
Yeah.
Then you're in build. And build to me is like we think of it a lot in like rapid prototyping. Like, how can I engage with this thing with what I have where I am right now without having to like uproot my life, without having to spend a bunch of money, without having to.
Unless you can.
If you can, great. A lot of us can.
But most of us can't.
Most of us
Yeah.
can't.
Yeah. And I think we need to be realistic about that. Yeah.
Absolutely. 10% closer is 10% closer.
Yeah.
Like the minimum is momentum.
Yeah. And I think that's such an important part because once you start to get a little bit closer, then you keep getting a little bit closer. It's like, climbing a mountain. You don't just end up at the top of the mountain. You take a step and then you take another step and then you take another step. And it's the accumulation of those steps that actually brings you to the top of the mountain.
Yeah.
And this is very similar to that, where you start taking steps that align, that you're building this thing that align with the work that you've done before that you just described. And then it brings you a little closer because you start doing this one thing and it might expose you to another thing. And that's where you don't necessarily have the perfectly paved out path and destination yet, but you're aligning. I love the word aligning.
Yeah.
Because it means what you're starting to do is compatible with the
Yeah.
things that you've deemed really important.
In that, you're embodying being the experiencer.
Yeah.
Like you are fully allowing yourself to like engage and embody this like different way of being.
Yeah.
And really trying it on.
Yeah.
Like it's so easy for us, I think, to be like, well, one day, like when conditions are right, I'll do that thing.
No,
And
start.
it's like, no, do however you can feel this right now, feel it.
Yeah.
And then, so that's
That build. Yeah.
And then we have like refine and revise. And so this is maybe a little bit more becoming the observer and kind of like taking stock of like, okay, how did these three phases talk to each other and how am I feeling right now?
Yeah.
And in this phase, you might be like, okay, this got me closer. It's not quite there. Let me go back to understand actually
Maybe
for
there's
a
more
little
I
bit.
need to
There's something
figure
else I
out.
need to dig into here. And then from understand, you might jump right back into build because
Yeah.
you're like, I got it. This makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's not linear in the way of like you have to go through every step every time.
Just the fact that there's a refine and revise shows that it's not linear.
Exactly.
And it also speaks to you don't have to be right. You
Right.
just have to start moving, and then you can play with the clay and reshape it. And if you don't like what you've started to create, break it back down.
Break it back down.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're all a phase. Like everything is a phase.
Yeah.
Where the self is constantly reinvigorating.
Yeah.
I think we can sometimes hold ourselves to who we understand ourselves to be or the
Yeah.
roles that we've consistently played in our lives.
Yeah.
And I think of this Ursula K. Le Guin quote, and it's, the forest dies and so it lives.
Mm.
And it, to me, it's just this very freeing way of engaging with ourselves. Like it's very important to let things go so that new things can grow in.
Mm.
And that's part of this human experience, is that as we age, as we experience new things, we're learning about ourselves in ways that we might not have expected before. And that it's okay for some parts to grow more or take more precedence than others that have served us in the past.
That's
And
so well said.
thank you. And that allowing that to unfold is what keeps getting us closer to where we want to be. And I say that in air quotes because it's like we're here now.
Yeah. One of the things I want to add to this too, a lot of times in design thinking, one of the stages somewhere toward the end is evaluate.
Mm-hmm.
And evaluate is to look at is what I've built working the way I hoped it would. And I think in this capacity, working in the way I hoped it would be is, am I feeling centered the way I want to feel centered about what I'm doing? Is this feeling aligned with my values? And that's so different than judging yourself for what you've built.
Mm.
It's, is this the right thing? Or do I need to tweak this? Do I need to change this in some way? Do I need to start all over again? Or can I work with what I've built and tweak it?
Right.
That's what evaluate is. It's not grading
Right.
or judging.
Right.
It's
tinkering.
evaluating the effectiveness so that you can tinker
Yeah.
in the way that makes sense as a next step.
One of the questions that I think can be really helpful as someone is starting to engage with this, where they're like, in the words of Glennon Doyle, like, isn't it supposed to be more beautiful than this? Like, as we feel that, I think sometimes that's a signal for us to shift towards something else. And one of the questions that I found myself asking and returning to as kind of a rhetorical question, but also as a very, very grounded, answerable question is, how do I want to engage with my aliveness? And it can also be asked as, how do I want to engage with my humanity? And then I think about like all of the ways humans have engaged with their humanity throughout time that I think often we tend to, in these days, like compress into something that must be good enough to engage with. And for me, that means like art, creative endeavors, singing, dancing, building friends, like these things that are so part of the human experience that I think we often put on the back burner. But once I started asking myself, how do I want to engage with my humanity? How do I want to engage with my aliveness? It was so much easier to prototype the life that I wanted to live. Because it's like, oh, this is my aliveness.
Yeah.
This is this medium that I have within me that wants to be used, wants to come out, wants to serve.
I think it's one of the ways that you actually start to understand and connect with your purpose.
Exactly.
This idea of engaging with your aliveness?
And it
Like
also
what, and it also, like, you have to start thinking about what compels me, like what inspires me, what feels alive
yeah.
and engaging and worth spending time on.
And I think this is going to sound like no, obviously, but maybe it won't. How do we, especially as adults, create space to engage with like joy and levity? Because I think again, so often we put that on the back burner.
Yeah,
Of
because
like,
we're busy
well,
adulting.
yeah, and I'll get to that when I'm in my dream life. Then I'll feel joy and levity and fun.
Yeah.
And part of finding direction in my experience was creating really intentional space for joy and levity and fun,
Yeah.
even in small ways. And the more that I felt that, the more that I felt this aliveness within me, the clearer the path became to where I wanted to go.
Mm.
And it was this like, at first I was like, oh, well, I haven't earned the joy. I
Mm.
haven't earned getting to engage with having fun.
Yeah.
And I think that's a way that we really cut off our own growth,
Yeah.
is thinking that fun, joy, and play are things we reach and earn rather than something inherent to us as humans.
Yeah. That is also so much of where the joy of life is, right? Yeah. I think as we round this episode out, the other thing I just say for all the listeners is, we're not suggesting by any stretch you just throw away the life you have.
No.
What we are suggesting is start thinking about the things you really want to engage with in your life and start doing it. And if all you have is 5 minutes a day to do that, then use those 5 minutes.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be your entire day or your entire life. Like, start with 5 minutes. And so if a way that you want to engage in life is to, start singing, for example, or you want to, just be more present, then take 5 minutes to practice whatever that thing is,
Yeah.
because that's where it builds. That's step one, and then maybe as time passes, you'll be spending a few more minutes or many more minutes. And that's how the change in your life happens and how the path unfolds to exactly where you want to direct yourself. And then in the end, knowing that that may also change and it's okay,
Mm.
you know?
I also think about how right now I want to be thoughtful about the times that we're living through.
Mm,
And I understand that us finding joy is really important can be a really hard thing to engage with, considering everything that's happening in the world. And I don't want us to be tone deaf to that. And I think a lot about this. Engaging with joy and engaging with playfulness in our own humanness is an act of resistance.
mm,
And that as we think about the world that we want to build, engaging with joy and play isn't erasing all of the things that are really hard. And it's not saying that those things don't exist. And I think it's really important that we do acknowledge that,
Yeah.
and that we are really fortunate to even be able to talk about wanting to engage with joy.
yeah.
And that in order for us to build a world that we want to live in, we have to practice living in that world too.
Yeah.
And it's a way of thinking about where we could go as a society and as a culture.
Yeah.
And that I truly do see it as this way of resisting the anger and the hurt and the vitriol that wants to divide us.
Yeah. Yeah. I think in thinking about what we do want, you have to practice what you want. And the more you practice what you want in the world, the more likely it is to spread, because that's how it spreads, not because nobody's doing it,
Right.
but because there are people who are engaging in the things that they want to see.
Yeah.
Thanks for talking with me about this.
Yeah,
This is, yeah, it's cool and really meaningful.
Agreed. It's cool to just keep hearing your thoughts on this and the way you experience it and sharing it with people. Cool. Till next time.
Till next time.
Thanks for hanging out with us. Join us next time as we explore the ways we perceive the interactions we have with the people and the world around us through a structure called the 7 levels of energy. You can find us anywhere you get your podcasts, or you can find us on YouTube at The Gnarliest Carly and at In the Groove Podcast. We would love to hear from you in the comments, or you can email us any of your thoughts and questions at podcast@groovespace.co. If you enjoy reading blogs and our innermost thoughts, check out the Substack at substack.com/@thegnarliestcarly. You can also find me on TikTok and Instagram at, you guessed it, The Gnarliest Carly. Until next time, take it easy. This podcast is produced by Carly Wanner-Hyde and Christine Wanner. Directing, editing, and filming by Erica Paparella. Support, show notes, and incredible questions by Kristen Pepin. Audio mixing and mastering by Tyler Paparella.